I'll make a statement and then I will spend the rest of the hour kind of justifying the statement. Hopefully 1% of it would make sense. In my opinion, Agile as it stands today is meant for totally dysfunctional teams. Hopefully you guys deserve something better than that. And then I'm going to talk about the rest of the 50 minutes that I have left about why I think Agile is totally broken and meant for dysfunctional teams, and what are some of the alternatives or some of the new thinking that's going on that some of the original leaders are actually doing, right? The original guys who came up with the Agile manifesto and some of the thinking behind it don't actually do any Agile anymore, right? So why is that you guys are still continuing doing that? Doesn't make any sense. So let's look at that, but before that let's take a little bit of history tour, right, to kind of understand what happened, what led to this, and then why we kind of completely missed the point. In fact, recently at the Agile India conference, Dave Thomas, who was one of the signatories of the Agile manifesto, he came up and he said, he basically put up a slide about Agile as it stands today, and he said this is exactly what we were trying to avoid, but we've ended up exactly in the same position. Right? So kind of unfortunate, but that's where we are. Does this sound familiar to anyone? Does this look familiar to anyone? This is kind of what software development looked in the 80s, right? Most of you are not old enough to remember what it was back in the 80s, but this is kind of what it looked like. Extremely complicated processes, one led to another, lots of checks and balances, gated processes, name it, you have it. Essentially people were getting treated like cogs in the wheel, and a lot of this was management hangover from the manufacturing or that kind of a background. In fact, the whole word software engineering completely makes no sense, but we kind of continue using that. What did this kind of heavyweight processes lead to, right? One is obviously lots of heavyweight processes, more and more upfront planning, very strict change control. If anyone remembers back in the days, we had all these CR requests and things like that you had to deal with. Very heavy reliance on documentation. Everything had to be documented for it to move forward. Even if you saw things were going nowhere or things were going wrong, you didn't really it felt like your hands and legs were tied. You couldn't do much. A lot of times communication gaps were visible very late in the process when hardly you could do anything. This is kind of some of the reactions that was happening back in the 80s and maybe early 90s. And if you actually look at some of the data that was published, if you look at the number of projects that were failing or were challenged, it was a very huge number. Project overruns was very high, both in terms of cost and in terms of time. If you looked at the number of features that were actually being built, only about 13% of the feature, 20% put together were often or always used, but a huge percent of the features were never or rarely used. If you asked in terms of predictability, the requirements as the size of the project grew, the requirements also changed quite drastically, and this curve kind of shows as your size of the requirements grows or size of your project grows, the amount of variability introduced in the requirements also grows. If it's a weekend project, more or less what's going to happen, things are not going to change. If it's a 5-year project, you can be guaranteed that 60 to 70% of it is going to change by the time you finish it, right? So this led to a lot of frustration for people. 17 people out of those bunch of frustrated people kind of got together and they wrote the Agile manifesto. Yeah, this is the story everyone knows. Later I'm going to talk about this is not a true story, but we'll see that. Right, everyone's familiar with the Agile manifesto. So all these problems, and they said, yes, here's the one solution that will solve all those problems, right? Take this medicine before sleeping and after waking up, and that's pretty much it, done. In my opinion, when Agile started, it was really about embracing uncertainty or change, because that was kind of what we were seeing at that point. That was the big problem, is to embrace uncertainty via simplicity, to simplify things down, right? Kind of, if you were to ask me 15 years ago, that was what agile really meant to me, and I think if you see now, things have gone quite different, but that was kind of really the essence of it. So if you look at the origins, it's quite anti-fragile in its origin. We'll define these terms in a minute for you, what is anti-fragile and things like that. Over the time, certainly agile has become very fragile in my opinion. Okay. Anyone's familiar with this book, Anti-Fragile? Yeah, I see one person nodding, which is good. If I am saying anything wrong, then at least one person knows. Otherwise, I can get away with whatever I want to say. In Anti-Fragile book, Taleb Nasib, he introduced 3 terms, or kind of put some context around that: fragile, robust and resilient, and then anti-fragile. So it's like you take any system, you can classify them into these 3 categories, right? They're either fragile systems, they are robust or resilient systems, and they are anti-fragile. So let's spend a minute to understand these definitions, and then we will go back and start attacking agile, right? That's the game plan. Everyone's familiar with what fragile is? Yeah? No? Of course. Think of a ball, a glass ball, right? What happens if you drop the ball? It's not designed to resist that kind of a pressure, and it would basically crack, right? So you would say this is very fragile, handle with care. When you check in bags, and if you have something fragile, you put a big sticker on it saying fragile, handle with care. What are the properties of a fragile system, right? Let's look at what are the properties of a fragile system. What makes something fragile? What do you guys think? What makes something fragile? It's very rigid. Rigid is not necessarily bad, because robust systems are also very rigid. Okay. The problem is that, or the first property that you will see is it dislikes variability or stress. The moment you put stress in a way, especially that it was not planned for, it will crack up, it will break, it will come, it will stop, right? Look at the traffic system with lights, traffic lights. Example of an extremely fragile system. The moment a light went off, it's completely chaotic, right? The system breaks down. This is not meant for any other use case than the one use case that it was designed for. So it seeks to eliminate variability, noise or tension. That's what anti-fragile systems, that's what fragile systems try to do. It is focused on consistency or standardization. So wherever you try to make something very consistent or standardized, you're doing that because you don't like variability. You don't like variability because if you introduce variability, the system will crack up, right? So anytime someone says that we want these all teams to be consistent, you know what they're talking about. They're overly optimized for a specific use case or a scenario. Most systems that are fragile are overly optimized for a particular use case or a scenario. They work well in that use case or a scenario, but anything outside that use case or a scenario, it will crack, it will break, it will stop, it will not function. They are prediction based, they are based on prediction. The way the system is designed, it's based on prediction. People try to understand what could possibly happen and design something based on that. So they're prediction based. They're typically large. So most large systems are fragile systems. Think of our banks, extremely fragile. Think of large countries with centralized economies, centralized government, extremely fragile systems. Is it making any sense? What is fragile, right? Some definition around that. Let's talk about what is robust or resilient. Resilient basically means that ability to withstand or recover quickly from difficult conditions, right? Think of a ball. unlike a glass ball, think of a rubber ball. A rubber ball when dropped wouldn't crack, right? It works fine. You put it in some other situations also, it works fine. Maybe if you try to burn it, it might not work very well, but most other cases it seems to be okay, right? Or the way we think about, our server deployments and things like that. Over the years we've learned a lot about server deployments and stuff like that, and we've made that very robust and resilient, right? When something unexpected happens, you have built a system in a way such that some other system will take over. You have, either active passive deployment strategies, you have load balancers, you have other kinds of things which makes it resilient, which means when an unexpected huge amount of traffic comes to your site, then the backups or the other servers, the load balancing will happen and the server will work fine. Or if one of the servers went down, then another server will come up and cater to the needs. So those are made, by designing the systems this way, you have made them robust or resilient. Okay, that's what robust or resilient means. What is anti-fragile then? Right? So we've looked at, I'm going really fast because I want to get to the meat of the stuff. This is just the definitions. No point spending too much time on that. What is anti-fragile systems? So anti-fragile, the definition is basically systems that gain from disorder or chaos, right? It's important to understand systems that gain from chaos, disorder, ambiguity, things that we don't like. It's stuff that gains from them, right? Think of this ball. Has anyone seen these kind of balls? When you drop them, it lights up, right? So they take advantage of the shock it's getting by converting that into some kind of an energy, right? Humans, right? Humans are one of the best known anti-fragile systems. We are beyond resilient, we are beyond robust, we are anti-fragile. What does that mean? The more you use your brains, right? The more you use your brains, the better they get. The more you stress them, the better they become capable of handling stress. When you go to a gym and you work out, what are you doing? You're putting a lot of stress and essentially tearing your muscles, and the muscles rebuild to become stronger. So the way to get stronger is to basically cause damage, right? The damage makes it stronger, better, more resilient. That's kind of what the gist of an anti-fragile system would be, right? So our bodies are very anti-fragile. Our bodies have the ability not only to recover but to become stronger. So when kids, we give vaccinations. We give them vaccines. Vaccines are nothing but small dosages of the actual bacteria or the whatever is causing certain diseases, so that the body builds resilience towards that, right? It causes damage so that it can become stronger. Think of an example of a tourist, right? A tourist who has tons of bags because they want to make sure all their luxuries are with them, and who has planned every little detail of their trip, right? Flight from this place, bus to this place, from there to the next thing, the movie ticket at certain point, a show ticket at certain point, every little detail is planned out. What do you think? Are they anti-fragile? Extremely fragile. Why are they fragile? Because one small miss anywhere along the line will completely ruin them. So what is the way to make them robust or resilient? The way to make that robust or resilient is to add some buffers in between, right? Don't jam pack the whole thing, add some buffers, travel light. These are few things that we have learned over the years. That's what was going to make them robust. Even if something goes back, they'll quickly be able to catch up the next thing and move on or stuff like that, right? That's robust. What will make them anti-fragile? What is anti-fragile? Taking advantage of an unexpected event. Resilient systems will be able to cope up to some extent, but not really. And anti-fragile is basically where, let's say you missed the bus, that's fine. maybe you've never even planned the whole trip. You're simply just going to show up to the next stop, and there, based on the information available, you're going to take advantage of what is the best thing you can do. Has anyone done like a hitchhiking trip? Few people. Those are one of those best trips where it's completely unknown. You take advantage of whatever comes your way, and you figure out the cheapest, easiest, most enjoyable trip with the options given to you. Right? That's one comparison. If I to relatively draw a comparison, if you think about tourists, there are these different kinds of tourists you can think of, right? The other example we all are very familiar with is the venture capitalists. Venture capitalists are known to be anti-fragile. Why are venture capitalists anti-fragile? They invest in maybe 10, 20, 50 startups at the same time. They know very well upfront that majority of these startups are going to fail, right? As a VC, when I invest my money, I know that if I'm investing in 10 companies, 9 of them will fail, right? So I have a fixed low loss that I know upfront. But that one company that might click, the gains are so high that it's worth losing the money on the 9 others. But there is no way to predict which of these 10 will succeed, which is why a lot of times you put money in multiple companies, sometimes even companies which are competing with each other. A lot of VCs invest in competing companies because they don't know which of these will succeed, and when some succeeds, the exponential growth will be so much more beneficial than doing a calculated investment. So if you are an investor, right, where do you put your money in? If you put your money in safe, risk-free investment, it's kind of the worst kind of investment to make, right? You basically, an anti-fragile way of investing would be you invest money, small amounts of money in lots of different types, some low risk and some very high risk, like extremes. And you know that there's some amount safety built in, but a lot of your money could go wasted, except that 1 or 2 will click and that will be a huge return, right? That's an anti-fragile way of looking at it. This is another very interesting example of anti-fragile. Terrorists are extremely anti-fragile. A small group of terrorists can hold a country at stake, right? How do they do that? So they're basically building on fear. And they never do the same thing again. Every time it's completely different, something new. So there is no way to predict them, right? And generally some of these, if you kill one, the other shows up somewhere, right? These are not like, just very hierarchical structures. They have, multiple structures going on within them. So they have a lot of redundancy and other kinds of things we'll talk about later built into them. So that makes them very anti-fragile, which is why we've been struggling as a community to fight against this for many, many years, and we still don't have a good solution for them. So let's talk about some of the properties of an anti-fragile system. What are the properties of anti-fragile system? We talked about some examples, so let's try and summarize those examples in terms of properties. First property is, if you have an anti-fragile system, it has layers of redundancy, right? Layers of redundancy, which the purpose of these layers of redundancy is to localize the impact. So when something happens, the impact is localized, the rest of the system needs to continue operating as before, and this system can bounce back into action very quickly, right? Anyone listening to this and coming from a lean background will run out of the room running, because it's kind of the exact opposite of lean. Lean is about eliminating waste. Anti-fragile is about introducing waste in the system so that there is duplication, there is redundancy in the system. That gives you the ability to deal with unexpected things, right? Basically what it means is decentralizing the systems and adding buffers and inventories. Give me an example, or let me give an example of what this means. Right? I have a centralized, electric system that runs through the country, right? And one point a storm hits, what happens? the entire country is wiped out of electricity, or at least that entire region would get wiped out of electricity. So that's a fragile system. That's built assuming that on a day-to-day basis you won't have storms, so it's okay, let's just run with this. But the moment you hit a storm or any other kind of unexpected event, you will essentially, it will be a catastrophic failure. Nothing can work. So what is the way of building redundancy and having localized impact? Is having small generators in everybody's house. Right, having small generators in everybody's house, or using solar or using other kinds of energies in everybody's houses, so that there is no centralized single point of failure. Robust way would be have multiple, but this goes all the way to the extreme, saying there is nothing, everything is decentralized and everything has duplication. It dislikes consistency and standardization, right? If you look at the original Agile manifesto and the whole reasoning behind it, the thought process was that one size fits all, or the standard way of having these processes don't work. Let each team figure out what works for them given their context, and let it evolve over a period of time. That's kind of very much why I said that there's a lot of similarity between the original thinking. But these days it's all about standard frameworks, standard this, standard that, everything, every single thing should be standardized, templates, measurements, everything. Less is more, or keep it small and simple, is kind of one of the core attributes of an anti-fragile system. So it's about taking any large system and breaking it down into very small pieces and making those pieces all redundant and decentralized. Right? That's kind of one of the core principles out there. Encourage optionality. Encourage optionality by deferring decision making to the last responsible moment. So when do you estimate when this feature will be done? Not when you start the project. You estimate it very closely to when you are actually going to build it, or probably not even estimate, we'll come to that in a little while. But you want to defer decision making to the last responsible moment so that you have more optionality. And why is more optionality better? Why having more options is better? Because you can be more opportunistic at that point in time based on what is the most profitable, most opportunistic solution. You could pick that, right? Which is why committing to something beforehand is a bad idea. This is like an anti-fragile way of thinking. Dislikes prediction. Prediction based systems essentially are fragile and they blow up. The last one is you intentionally fail frequently. You intentionally fail frequently. You go to a gym and you tear your muscles almost every other day. That is to build stronger muscles, right? Or you expose yourself to stress because you want to get better ability in terms of mental processing. So that's kind of some of the core properties or attributes of an anti-fragile system. So far, is everyone with me? Yes? If we look at this and we see the original Agile manifesto, can you see there being similarities in terms of the thought process? Yes? No? So we were not committing to the project end date at the start of the project. We were saying let us basically work in small cycles and we'll figure it out. So deferring those decisions so you can be more opportunistic, right? That was kind of one of the core things in Agile. These days pretty much at the beginning of the project people plan out all their releases, all their sprints, and everything is jam packed and they call that Agile. Right? That's kind of not true. This consistency thing I talked about, or small. Agile was very big on, small, keeping things small and simple, right? If you see extreme programming, that's a very big thing inside extreme programming, is around the whole simplicity and maximizing the amount of work not done so that things are simple and small. Quickly kind of jump into a commercial break and then come back. So my name is Naresh Jain. I live in Mumbai. I was a partner at a company called Industrial Logic where we built the first e-learning I did another startup which failed, of course, miserably. It's Adventure Labs. We were building games for kids to learn mental arithmetics. I've done a bunch of other things. I started the Agile movement in India in 2004, and funnily, I talk about why Agile is dead, because I've been in that space long enough. Right now, I'm building another startup. It's called ConfEngine. It's for conference organizers. It's a conference management platform. So that brings us back to why I made that statement that over the years Agile has become extremely fragile. Most people will not be convinced yet. Or is everyone convinced already that Agile is very fragile? Quick show of hands, how many people think Agile is fragile? People are afraid, you might get bashed.
The way that Agile is being used, I agree, is definitely fragile.
The way Agile is being used is extreme.
But as you said, the Agile Manifesto itself is actually anti-fragile. Like the principles they're talking about are not what's actually happening in reality.
Yeah, that's the problem though, right? In
Yeah.
theory, it was supposed to be like that, but the reality is very different from the theory. So let's forget the theory. The reality is what is really affecting us. And when it started, maybe it was quite anti-fragile back in the time for what it was trying to solve. But it's been 15 years, close to 15 years, and things have evolved quite a bit. And I'm going to talk about some of the things that the manifesto itself was wrong in some sense, in my opinion, and there's a better way to do that. So what I want you to do is take quickly, like 2 minutes and note down what you think is wrong with Agile today. So that when I go through my list, you can say, hey, tick mark, this is done, this is done, this is done. Right? I want you to quickly note down what you think is wrong in Agile today. Who in the room has nothing on their list? You should write the next manifesto. I'm hoping everyone has at least a few things on their list, everyone's pet peeves about things. I'm going to go through my pet peeves. I'm going to go through I have 10 points that I'm going to discuss. I'm going to talk about what's wrong with them, and I'm going to talk about what is an anti-fragile way to deal with those problems. All right. First one, my favorite one, or one of the favorite ones, story points. Any idea who came up? So do you guys do planning poker or any of that nonsense? Some people do. Who came up with story points? Story point planning poker estimation. We don't know, we don't care, but we're going to follow like a herd.
Did Mike Cohn invent it?
No, Mike Cohn takes too much credit for stuff he's not done. James Grinning came up with planning poker, and in a few weeks he said this bullshit doesn't work, and he moved on. And then the whole Scrum community is like, yeah, planning poker, right? Why doesn't it work? How many people think it works actually? I'm going to talk about why it's fundamentally flawed. Forget it works or not, why it's fundamentally flawed. So the extreme programming community came up with the concept of story points, all right? And the idea was that, if we give actual estimates in terms of effort estimation, when we give effort estimation, our managers hold a gun against our head and ask us, why is this not done when the time is over, right? So let's introduce one level of indirection. Let's introduce one level of indirection by not giving an actual number, but actually giving a relative number. What's the concept of relative story point estimation or relative sizing? So basically you're doing a relative sizing. And then the reason we picked up, what is the numbers we pick up for story points? Fibonacci series or some series which is non-linear, right? What does that mean? We don't pick 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Why we didn't pick 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Because then our managers who are very smart can look at 2 and say, oh, 2 means twice the effort of 1, right? And then they can tie you back into actual arithmetics, saying 2 is now so much time is done, why is this not done? 1 was already done at this point, now twice that time this should have been done. So the reason we picked a non-linear sequence like a Fibonacci series was to basically clearly highlight that this is not a linear sequence and you cannot apply arithmetics on it. Okay, that was the reasoning behind picking a non-linear sequence. Okay, we just made that statement and then we turned around and we said, what is your velocity? Just add all the story points that you finished in the last sprint, that's your velocity. Hey, hang on, 1 second, pause, go back. You just said 10 seconds ago that we can't apply arithmetics on it. And now you're saying you just total it up and that's your velocity. So if my velocity was 10 last sprint, right, does that mean next sprint I can do 10 one-pointer stories? Good luck with that. Fundamentally flawed. I don't believe, the community has gone so far with this nonsense. So velocity is basically killing agility. There's a lot of stuff that people are talking about this. It's a very output centric approach, measuring what did you produce rather than looking at what was the outcome of what you did, right? Just because you wrote, it's taking us back in the day when we used to measure lines of code. It's as bad as that. What's a anti-fragile way of looking at this? Basically the whole no estimation movement, which is essentially trying to talk about, let's not focus on the numbers or the velocity or things like that, let's focus on the flow, let's focus on delivering value consistently and use that as a way to see if we are doing better or not, right? Because estimations are generally used to measure if you are improving, if there is room for more productivity and things like that. Right, so instead of focusing on productivity and associating that with the number of lines of code or the number of story points or whatever nonsense you might have, instead focus on the actual value delivered to end users, right, and use that as a way to measure. And again, because it's continuous deployments, which means that every time a developer checks in code, it goes into production. How many people have worked in systems where you check in code and it goes straight to production? Couple of people, right? That feels totally different. When you're doing that, no one comes and asks you what is the estimate for this. Because your ability to push things into production so quickly, so fast is that high that by the time you talk about estimation, that feature would have been pushed into production already. Right? So moving to this whole mindset of constantly delivering value instead of debating about how much story points is this and things like that and arguing about prediction, making predictions. Let's just focus on pushing things into productions as quickly as possible. Let it fail, but fail in small chunks over there so that we can quickly recover, right? That's give you the anti-fragility. So next time you will be more smarter. Right? The biggest fear is if you keep pushing into production very quickly, it's going to fail. Yes, let it fail. Build a system that can take those kind of shocks, because otherwise you're going to fail big, catastrophically. Right? That's the kind of anti-fragile thinking out there. Next one, definition of done. How many people have definition of done? This is what I call a hangover from a checklist based project management school of thought. Right? This is something from the Scrum Alliance website. I was like, my God, people write like all this bullshit, like do they have time, like unit tests written, code completed, how is the task completed if the code is not done? I mean, do I even need to write that? Then next thing you will see is people writing, did you breathe? Otherwise people might forget breathing, right, and people might die. I mean, where do you draw the line for stupidity? Do we really need these kind of checklists? I mean, hopefully you're not going off the street and hiring people, right? You're getting reasonable people, training them, giving them the required skill so that you don't need to waste your time on stuff like this. Instead, focus on things like deploying stuff very quickly, have a DevOps kind of a thing so that there is no debate about what is done, what is not done. It would fail in one of your pipeline and then you will get the feedback, right? It would fail at one of your points of the this thing and you will get feedback. Or have out a safe fail rollout strategy. So when I worked at Gmail team, we would deploy code into production 17 times every day. It wouldn't go to a person sitting in Sri Lanka right away, because that would be too risky, right? It would go to all Gmail team employees first. Then it would go to all the Google employees. Then it would get rolled out to California. Then it would get rolled out gradually out, right? So if it failed, it would have localized effect. If it didn't fail all this while, it's the chances are it might not fail, and it just rolls out. And all of this is automated so that you have actual data to make these decisions if this goes to the next level or does not go to the next level. It is not someone putting a stamp on it saying, okay, this can go to the next level, or there is no debate about this is done, this is not done, right? Because it's just all automated in the system. This is not something you have to worry about. How many people have this feeling that once we move to Agile, it's just ceremonies and meetings. I hardly have any time left to do any work. Wasn't that the point, that we were spending way too much time doing process crap, that we wanted to be agile so that we can be more productive? But now I have to go for that grooming meeting. Oh wait, there is a pre-planning meeting. Oh wait, there is something else before that. There is a pre-stand-up planning meeting. I've been at companies where they have a 30-minute meeting to decide what they're going to talk in their stand-up. Right, so that the client who is sitting in the US doesn't, come to know what crap is going on. It's just, unbelievable. So more process is not the answer. There is something in anti-fragile which is called negativita, which essentially means throwing out stuff. Right, so the answer is throw out practices. Right, I ask often teams, how many years you've been practicing Agile? They said 3 years, 5 years, brilliant. Do you do stand-up? Yes. It's like, my God, it's been 3 years and you still do stand-ups? Something's really broken over here. How many people do stand-up meetings? No. No. Is it helping you guys? No, but we still do it. Some people say it's helping us. Then you say, okay, how do you know it's helping you? Have you not done it and seen the impact? The answer is no. Then how do you know? Are you stuck? Are you stagnated? Thinking that that's the best way to do something because you've not actually tried something out. What happened to the whole continuous improvement mindset? Right? You have to constantly throw out practices. If you look at my team today, right, we are a team of 6 people distributed. Everyone lives in a different city. No one lives in the same city. We're all as distributed as it can get. We don't have a backlog. And the product is in production. We are shipping new releases every day, and no one's died because of it. Right? We don't have a backlog. No developer is asked to estimate, because by the time we have that whole discussion, things would have been pushed into production already. Right? We don't have a backlog. We don't have this. We don't do stand-ups. We meet. We basically are chatting on Telegram. That's kind of what we use. We have version control where people check in code, but sometimes we do go directly on the server and change code. Right? We have 0 automated tests. Yep.
Naresh, is it a mission critical system like finance?
Everything is a mission critical system. We've done over 3 crores of transactions through our system. Financial transactions. People buying tickets for a conference and stuff like that, and actual money involved. Right? And 3 crores worth of transactions already done. We have 0 automated tests. Because you never know if something is working for you unless you throw it out. Right? Like people say, you never know your spouse's value unless she's gone. Right? It's like that. You wouldn't know what the value is unless you see what the other side is, and maybe you will find a better way to do something. So the point I'm trying to make is less process or no process or null process is what is important, not more process and adding a lot of more checks and balances. That's kind of the fragile way of thinking. The anti-fragile way of thinking is, basically kind of become the Zen, give away stuff as much as possible. Collaboration amplified. Agile is one thing. My personal complaint has been that it's pushed the envelope way too much on collaboration. Anything and everything should be collaboration. People have to go to the bathroom also together, right? Because you are pairing, so you have to do that together as well, right? It's really pushing the envelope way too much. The problem is we don't even quite understand what collaboration means at this point. We've forgotten what it means because everything is collaborative, and so the boundaries have all blurred out. Right? What do we mean by collaboration? So let me ask you another question. Think about your best work-related idea. Right? Everyone's had a best work-related idea, something that you came up with which you felt like really good, and other people praised you saying, "Wow, that was brilliant, man." Right? Everyone's had that moment. Else I feel sorry for you. All right. Where did you have that idea? Put up your hands if you had that idea when you were collaborating and working with other people. One person. I've asked this question in many different conferences, many different places, and it's usually, a handful of people who would put up their hands. Majority of the people, while walking the dog, while taking a shower, while sitting on the pot, while doing something else, right? Very few times it is that I was collaborating with people and I had this eureka moment that, hey, this is what should be done. How many people wrote the Agile Manifesto? I already told the answer earlier on, right, if you were paying attention. 17 white men wrote the Agile Manifesto, is the story we all know. Reality, 2 people wrote it. Rest of them all disagreed, argued and left. And then 2 people wrote it and everybody came back saying, we've already spent too much time, let's just be done with this. This is more or less what we all agree, so let's be done with this. And since then, those 17 people have not come back into a room together. And we talk so much about collaboration. Right? Unbelievable. Think about open source projects. How many people think open source project is collaborative? Linux Towards got into a room with 20 other people and came up with the charter of what the Linux operating system should be. And then they came up with story point estimates and then divided the work into 7 sprints. And then they delivered the best operating system out there. Hopefully that's not the story, right? Some guy wanted to scratch his personal itch, started writing it. Other people said, hey, this doesn't quite do what I want. And they started doing it. They didn't care. They didn't have a vision. They didn't, collaborate with anybody else. In fact, most people, basically duplicated work. Because that's where most innovative ideas come from. So, what I was talking about is referred to as set-based development. Set-based development is where you basically allow independent, autonomous teams to parallelly build the same solution so that the best of the breed ideas win. And that's where you find the most novel and innovative ideas coming from, right? That's how, if you look at the App Store, many people trying to build the same apps independently on their own. And some of those apps is what will win the market and will become the most predominant this thing. But the cost of failure is so low, it takes me a few days and few, 1,000 rupees to actually build an app, so that the cost is so low that we can afford to have these maximum parallel experiments going on. You asked about mission critical systems. In fact, the most important mission critical systems are built this way. because they cannot afford to trust one group of people to make the right decisions. And wherever they have done, they have regretted it. Right? It's generally a lot of parallel development going on, multiple people trying to solve the same problem to figure out the best of the breed ideas. Right? I have 12 minutes left. Technical debt. How many people have technical debt on their teams? Everyone has. If you don't put your hands up, you're lying. Everyone has technical debt. And the agile communities made it look really bad that you have technical debt. You stupid guy, you have technical debt. But that's kind of the metaphor, right? What is the metaphor? Ward Cunningham came up with this metaphor of technical debt. He was trying to explain to the folks from the financial domain that, if you're moving too fast, right, you have to take sometimes shortcuts, and it's okay to take shortcuts. It's okay to have some debt. As long as it's short-term, low-interest debt, it's perfectly okay. But if you take lot of long-term, large-interest loans, then you're going to be in a trouble. Right? So it's okay to have a lot of short-term, low-interest loans. Every now and then we do that. For us to be able to move faster, for us to be able to validate something before we go off and start building, bells and whistles around it. What is an anti-fragile way of dealing with technical debt? What's an anti-fragile way of dealing with technical debt? So anti-fragile says that have technical debt all your heart, which is what we did, right? 0 automated tests and pure procedural code, not a single class in our whole code base, pure procedural code and PHP, right? None of these is like the best of the breed, any of these stuff. But we threw away code almost every other week. Right? Throw away code. Throw away code, use microservices kind of a mindset where you can completely throw away pieces of it, let there be lots of duplication, let there be a lot of that, you'll just knock it off and just keep moving further. Some of these are very debatable, very, will make you feel very uncomfortable. But this is something I want you to think about. This is kind of where a lot of the thought leaders are moving today. This is not, they are not sitting and doing sprint planning and stuff like that. This is where things are moving. Anyone feel the micromanagement problem after moving to Agile? No? Even though it's not the intent of Agile, even though it wants to do the exact opposite thing, right? It ends up becoming micromanagement. Why? Because the more data you show to someone, the more they're interested to know more. We are all curious people, right? You first show your daily progress, they want to know hourly progress. Then they say, why don't you have a burn down and a burn up so we can all visualize what's going on? Great idea. Then the next thing is, let's do a little bit more of that. Let's give more frequent feedback. Every time the build goes, let's send out an email to everyone so everyone knows what's going on, right? Some of these things are well intended, but actually they end up leading you to do more micromanagement, because when more information is visible, you're more interested in getting more information. Even though you don't want, you kind of get engrossed, right? So there's a thin line you need to figure out, and there's this whole thing about how open source projects are run, right? Or how programmer anarchy. Has anyone heard of programmer anarchy? Google up after this and see what programmer anarchy is. It's a very interesting experiment done at a company called Forward Internet Group in London. Around the same time, I was working at another company in Mumbai, and we were kind of doing similar stuff, which is essentially, there is no management controlling things. It's essentially programmers running off in all different directions and doing whatever they think is good for the company. And surprisingly, a lot of high. So anyone knows of this throwing the shoes at Obama, or it's not Obama, at Bush, that game? There was a game that came. It was launched 3 hours after this incident happened. and that game made $1.6 million for this company. It was built in 3 hours. This is, where programmers are left loose and they just go find stuff and they do things, right? Or this Forward Internet company, which was, basically started ordering parrot or bird cages because they looked at the internet traffic and they said a lot of people are searching for it, but there are no parrot cages available in London. So they just went and manufacturer ordered a huge bunch of them and made a huge profit on it. Right? It's like totally nonsensical, but this kind of what is happening out there as a way of, don't tell me what needs to be done, we will just figure it out. I probably have time for one and then I'll kind of shut up. Scrum Master and Product Owner. How many people have those roles? In my opinion, this is one of the most half-assed thinking out there in the Agile community. I mean, look at any successful product companies. Do they have roles like this? I happen to be fortunate at working at least at a few of these companies, right? And they never had any such stupid roles like this. They had one person who was in charge of the product because it was that person's vision to build that product. If you take example of Google, right? The way products start in Google is if it's your idea, they used to have this 80-20 thing, right? And 20% of your time, free time, you can go do whatever you feel like, right? Do work on whatever you want. Gmail, Google Maps, a lot of these came out of that 20% time. So what would happen is you would come up with the idea, then you have to pitch it to other people in the company to donate their 20% time to your project, right? So you have to learn the skill of convincing other people that, hey, this is a really cool idea and you should be working on this idea. So you learn how to pitch this to other people, right? And it's your vision, so you kind of drive it. And then you get other people. When you've got a substantial amount of people and you can actually prove, then you can go and pitch it to your senior leadership saying, hey, this seems like a cool idea. We want to go from 20% to 80%. And we need this kind of a funding, right? And as long as you can prove that, you're given the funding and you run with it, right? Unfortunately, they don't have, you don't get a revenue share out of that, but there are some companies who do that also. They push the envelope one more further. Anyone's heard of this company called 3M? What does it stand for? It was a mining company, Minneapolis mining company, something. 3M, that's what it stands for. Today they do all kinds of random stuff. Your post-its come from 3M, they are the guys who kind of invented that. They do a lot of films that are put on cars, washers for cars, all kinds of random things. The way 3M works is that, you have an idea, you go run with it, convince other people. If it's successful, you get a stake in it, you keep running with it, and you basically run like a startup, right? If you fail, then you have to go work 3 years under someone else till you learn how to run this again, and then you can go and do your own thing, right? That's kind of the whole ecosystem in 3M. So they're kind of very diverse as a company, gone into different directions. They don't have a Scrum Master and a Product Owner. Okay, going to skip that, but this is good one. I want you to read this. This is why intentionally a lot of stuff was left fill in the blanks kind of a thing in the Agile. But today it is all, find the void, because everything is filled up. Anyway, the list goes on. I had a few other things around. Yeah, scaling frameworks. Lots of different scaling frameworks, right? Brilliant marketing gimmick. Great money-making machines. These guys are anti-fragile. If you want to learn about anti-fragility, you should learn from these guys, right? Brilliant, because they came up with an idea that is what people want. They want to scale things, right? So they came up with the idea. You're basically giving people what they want and making money out of it. What's your downside in this? Nothing. You have nothing to lose. Companies take this and go to dogs. You have nothing because you have no skin in the game, right? Then those guys leave the company and put a case study on their website saying how great it was. Then you go to that company and you're like, where is that? You talked about this, I don't see any of this. Oh no, that guy left, he took all of this with him. Right? Go to the SAFE website, look at all the case studies and then go and visit those companies and see the difference, spot the difference for yourself. This is what happens when you don't have skin in the game, right? I can publish whatever I feel like, because who cares? And then I can get away with whatever I can say. I can make claims that 800% productivity gain. How do you verify that? But then we blindly follow, oh yeah, this is awesome, right? So we can go and run behind all of these. The key is, if you actually see what some companies have tried to do, is they've actually, instead of scaling it up, they've tried to scale it down. Build tribes, build companies like 3M, which don't need a scaling framework. They need a distribution framework, just distribute out, right? If you look at what's happening in the, the whole Node.js community, if tech folks are here, in Node.js community, we don't, try to have one big massive server and keep trying to scale it up. Instead, we take functionality and break it into smaller chunks and put it on different nodes, right? Not the whole thing, but we basically take services and distribute it across. And that's how you scale out. You don't scale up, you scale out, right? Something similar is what, for example, Spotify did some very interesting things around, the whole tribes thing, basically forming tribes and letting those tribes be autonomous and working on their own. So that's kind of, in my opinion, a good way to scale things. But I am out of time, so thank you for listening and bearing with me for all this while. Hopefully this was entertaining at the least.